As the moon rose high in the sky, the cemetery gates creaked open, and a lone figure emerged from the darkness. This one glinted in his eye, and an unrelenting determination burned within his bones to embark on a journey to learn about chivalry, justice, sacrifice, and honor. Join our Skelly protagonist on a journey where he ascends from an undead skeleton to a righteousness paladin. In a sleepy little fishing port of the southern continent, where the only thing to worry about was a crab stealing your bait, something sinister has stirred up the town. The calm and tranquility were shattered as soldiers and guards marched in, armed to the teeth and ready to take on the undead. They warned the locals that there was a flesh-eating monster on the loose, and before you know it, the residents were running for their lives like they were auditioning for the next Olympic Games. They barricaded their doors and windows tighter than a pickle jar lid, hoping to keep out the ravenous beast. The guards marched through the streets, their footsteps echoing like a drumroll signaling impending doom. They were on a mission to pulverize the undead into bone powder. Little did they know, a frightened skeleton was cowering behind a wooden crate, wondering what he did to deserve such cruel treatment from the humans. Just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was a kitty cat, of all creatures, questioning why an undead was roaming around a human town. The Skelly's jaw dropped to the ground, he couldn't believe his bony eyes and ears. A talking cat? He let out a scream so high-pitched, he almost nailed the chorus of "Rolling in the Deep." The cat was caught off guard by the Skelly's bone-chilling scream and promptly returned the favor by letting out a blood-curdling howl. Skelly quickly clamped a bony hand over the cat's mouth, trying to hush the cat before it brought the entire town down on them. Kitty was not amused, especially since it was Skelly who had started the whole scream fest in the first place. Skelly blushed, realizing that he might have overreacted just a tad bit, but come on, anyone would scream if they saw a talking cat, right? As Skelly examined the kitty cat more closely, he noticed something strange. The cat wasn't just any ordinary cat, it was a ghost possessing a cat's body. Kitty swiped Skelly's hand away and gave him a lecture about how many animals in the world are possessed by ghosts. Then it hit Kitty, why was Skelly, a skeleton, roaming the streets? Was this his first time out here? Kitty absolutely crushed it. It correctly pointed out that Skelly is a first-timer here. And then, Skelly went on to spill the beans about his past, and it's sure a real doozy. Skelly was born from the deep, dark abyss. And at the time, he was a real weakling. But this clever little skeleton had a brilliant idea. He pretended to be a skeleton specimen so he could study alongside the great Lich, Bruto. Talk about a sneaky move. And it worked like a charm. Skelly was able to hide behind the magician for years without anyone suspecting a thing. But then, disaster struck. Bruto wanted to turn Skelly into a skeleton soldier to run some errands. And, well, let's just say Skelly wasn't exactly thrilled about that idea. In a fit of fear, Skelly took off like a bat out of hell. But he didn't go quietly. Oh no, he accidentally knocked over all of Bruto's experimental equipment and made off with a ton of treasure. As you can imagine, the Great Lich was not happy about this turn of events. In fact, he was downright furious. And he threatened to teach Skelly a lesson he'd never forget. Well, needless to say, Skelly wasn't about to stick around and find out what that lesson might entail. He hightailed it out of there so fast, you'd think he had a rocket strapped to his bony behind. Upon hearing that Skelly had some beef with the Great Lich, Kitty took a few steps back and said it was wonderful meeting Skelly, but it was time to say farewell. He told Skelly to pretend they never met, turned around, and slapped his own face, knowing full well that curiosity killed the cat. But Skelly wasn't having it. Oh no, he grabbed onto Kitty's tail and wouldn't let go. Kitty was not pleased, he didn't want anything to do with Skelly. But all Skelly wanted to know was why humans were targeting him too. He had never caused any problems. Kitty couldn't believe Skelly's naivete. She pointed out the obvious, it's because he's an undead skeleton. The undead is seen as the source of disaster. Skelly was confused, isn't Kitty also a undead? Kitty quickly set the record straight. No, he is a ghost, but he is loved by humans. Generous girls make pillows and cover the sun for him, and people give him delicious food and serve him well. He's living the dream, folks. And Skelly? Well, let's just say he's got some work to do if he wants to win over the human crowd. Oh, the drama never ends with Skelly. He was still scratching his bony head, trying to figure out why he wasn't getting the same love and attention as Kitty. After all, he did everything Kitty did, but still no chest pillow for him. And to make matters worse, Skelly tried to act cute by rolling around on the floor, but instead of getting cuddles, people tried to smash his bones. It's like the whole world is against him. As Kitty turned his back on Skelly, he could feel his heart pounding. He was about to put some serious distance between himself and that bumbling buffoon when Skelly's bony grip clamped down on his shoulder. What the heck, Kitty screeched, squirming to get free. But Skelly just held him tighter and pointed towards the town square. Led by a white-haired damsel. The knight next to her referred her as Miss Irene, and Skelly couldn't help but notice how darn cool they looked. The cavalry squad started asking why the town was deserted, but before anyone could answer, a plump guard waddled up and spilled the beans. There was an undead creature on the loose. Skelly's jaw dropped at the sight of this ironclad and he turned to Kitty with a newfound sense of purpose. Why are these lumpy guys so respected? He asked. Kitty rolled his eyes. They're knights, Skelly. They protect the people. As the sun began to set, Skelly, or rather, Grey, was already gearing up for his new life as a knight. Kitty could hardly believe his eyes as he watched Grey don a full suit of iron armor that he had blatantly stolen from a nearby shop. But that wasn't all. Grey had also somehow gotten his hands on a knight manual, which he believed would make him a master of chivalry in no time. Kitty snorted in disbelief. What a joke. He tried to reason with Grey, telling him that he needed a horse to be a proper knight. But Grey just shrugged off his concerns, muttering something about a great soul and chanting some kind of spell. Suddenly, a portal opened up in front of them, and out stepped the biggest darn horse Kitty had ever seen. Its name was apparently Tanitos. Grey wasted no time holding tightly on Teredo's mouth, informing him that he is now undead. Meanwhile, Irene strode confidently into the lord's castle of the fishing port, her eyes flashing with determination. As she entered the grand hall, she was greeted by a fat noble named Casper. She greeted him politely. It wasn't long before Casper revealed his true intentions. He wanted to arrange a marriage between Irene and his son. Irene's stomach churned with disgust at the mere thought. She knew all too well that this was just another attempt to steal her inheritance. After all, her father, the Grand Duke, had named her as his heir. But then a mysterious boy suddenly appeared out of nowhere after his father's passing, claiming to be the Grand Duke's son. And of course, the king had conveniently ignored her father's will and declared the boy as the rightful heir. But Irene wasn't about to let Casper and his cronies get the best of her. With a cool, calm demeanor, she respectfully declined the offer of marriage. But Casper wasn't so easily dissuaded. Not only did he betray his vow that he made before the Grand Duke to remain loyal to Irene after he passed away, but he also revealed the truth about the treaty between himself and the king, a treaty that stipulated that Irene would indeed be married to Casper's son. Irene stood tall and bold as she threw the white handkerchief in front of Casper, her eyes ablaze with fury. Enough is enough, she declared, her voice echoing through the grand hall. I challenge you to a new vow. Meanwhile, in the deserted town, the guards were hot on the heels of Grey. The trio scrambled behind a building, desperately trying to avoid detection. Grey, still determined to become a knight, was trying on his stolen armor and preparing a set for Tanitos. But Kitty was fuming with anger, calling Grey an idiot for thinking that an undead who's from the dark world could ever become a knight from the world of lights. Grey simply shrugged off the insult, insisting that he knew holy magics which will help him to join the ranks of the light camp. Tanitos, who seemed to have inherited some of Grey's quirks, chimed in, declaring that Grey would become the first ever holy lich in history. But Kitty wasn't convinced, muttering under his breath that they were all a bunch of mental hospital escapees. Kitty collapsed onto the ground, feeling defeated and exhausted. He had lost all hope and had no desire to keep going. But suddenly, Grey came up with a crazy idea: turn Kitty into an undead. Kitty was horrified by the suggestion and immediately sprang back to his feet. He decided to channel his frustration into guiding Gray towards becoming a real knight. With a renewed sense of purpose, Kitty was ready to lead the charge toward their noble quest. Suddenly, the guard's eyes widened in shock as he spotted a mysterious figure riding a majestic horse down the dark, deserted street. Gray's heart pounded in his chest as he nervously approached the guards, but Kitty urged him to keep moving forward. Just as they thought they were in the clear, a booming voice stopped them in their tracks. The tension in the air was palpable as the guard warned them about undead hiding in the city and a strict curfew that was in place. Little did the guard know, Gray had used his incredible magical powers to hide himself and his trusty companion Tanitos in a suit of armor. The disguise was so convincing that even the guard was fooled by it. Meanwhile, Irene gazed up at the bright, glowing moon with a look of uncertainty etched across her face. She turned to her loyal knight and asked if she had made a mistake. The knight reassured her that it was not a mistake, but questioned why she had chosen such a perilous path by agreeing to such harsh conditions. Irene knew that there was no other way to get Casper to agree to the duel, and with only 20 knights at her disposal, she was hopelessly outnumbered. She had no choice but to seek the aid of a nearby group of mercenaries. As fate would have it, the trio stumbled upon a bustling tavern filled with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of delicious food. Gray's senses were immediately overwhelmed by the lively atmosphere, but his attention was quickly drawn to the beautiful waitress who greeted him with a curtsy and addressed him as Mr. Knight. Little did Gray know, the unusual armor he wore had already caught the attention of two burly men from a notorious group called the Red Scorpions. As they sat down to eat, Kitty nervously asked Gray if he had any money on him. Gray reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver coin that he had taken as a souvenir from the Great Lich's house. Kitty's face fell as he realized they were in for a rough time without any proper funds. But Gray was not one to be deterred. He spotted a group of men gathered around a table gambling and knew exactly what he needed to do. With confidence in his heart, Gray strode over and joined in the game. In no time at all, he had won round after round, raking in a small fortune. Kitty suggested that Gray intentionally lose a few games to avoid drawing attention to himself, but Gray was confused. Why should he lose when he could easily win? Before he could contemplate any further, a man sitting across from him at the table challenged him to a one-on-one match. A chill ran down Kitty's spine as he sensed something was off. He pleaded with Gray to turn down the challenge, but Gray simply smiled and agreed, leaving Kitty in a state of shock and despair. He could feel her body convulsing, and as he coughed up blood, he couldn't help but slap Gray's head with his tiny paws, calling him an idiot. Moments later, Gray and Kitty left the tavern with a bag full of silver, but Kitty couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. He knew that always winning might not be the best choice in the dangerous world of humans. And before he knew it, the worst fears were confirmed. They were soon surrounded by a group of gangsters, who had their weapons pointed at them. As the tension mounted, Tanitos slowly approached with his eyes ablaze. Gray quickly mounted Tanitos, and the powerful horse began to charge at the gangsters, striking them with his hooves with incredible force. Within seconds, the gangsters were lying on the ground, defeated and dazed. Bystanders looked on in amazement, and even the two men from the Red Scorpions were left speechless. Kitty, himself, was stunned. He had never thought that Tanitos would fight so fiercely. The next day in the arena, Paz marched with his mercenary group, heads held high, ready to conquer the tournament. Gray, with his eyes set on the prize, marched alongside him, his fiery determination burning brighter than the sun. As they approached, the Lady Irene bestowed upon them the temporary title of knight, but Gray wasn't having any of that nonsense, he wanted the real deal. Meanwhile, Casper sat smugly in his spectator seat, thinking he was going to crush the competition. He even had the audacity to tease Irene. Then, a butler appeared, bellowing out the rules. It was to be one-on-one combat until the last man was left standing. The spectators, who were mostly on Casper's side, started to ridicule Irene and her measly 20 knights who were about to face off against hundreds of Casper's knights. The tension was palpable as the tournament began, but to everyone's surprise, Irene's knights won the first battle, and then the second. But alas, they lost the third, and it was clear that Casper's numerical advantage was starting to show. Irene bellowed her command to the knight, demanding that he summon the mercenaries and prepare them for the tournament, but the ragtag group of hired swords seemed less than thrilled at the prospect of facing insurmountable odds. Their spirits were dampened by the sight of their outnumbered and outgunned position. A voice boomed out from the throng of onlookers. It was the enigmatic figure of Gray, who boldly stepped forward and asked to be made a knight. Gray didn't want to settle for a mere temporary title, he was aiming for the real deal. And although the man in charge initially balked at the request, Irene was not one to shy away from a challenge. She declared that Gray would be granted the coveted title of knight if he could vanquish an army of 50 men. Kitty, on the other hand, was less than thrilled with this idea and implored Gray to refuse. But Gray was undaunted and gave a resounding thumbs up, much to Kitty's chagrin. Gray assured Kitty that Tenidos could take on 100 men with ease. Kitty quickly reminded Gray that this was a foot battle, and only the victors would be allowed to advance to the horse battle. Furthermore, Kitty questioned Gray's shockingly non-existent swordsmanship skills. From his perch in the spectator seat, Casper couldn't resist the opportunity to sneer and ridicule Irene for hiring a ragtag group of mercenaries to compete in the tournament. But as the last battle concluded and the dust settled, a new contender emerged. It was Paz, the captain, and to everyone's surprise, he was on an absolute rampage. He won battle after battle with ease, racking up an impressive pentakill in no time. Casper's evil smirk gave way to a look of concern as he sent a towering figure into the arena to fight Paz. Meanwhile, Gray was struggling to wield his sword and make any progress. Back in the arena, the tension was palpable. The referee announced the start of the fight, and the towering figure charged at Paz with his mace raised high. But Paz was quick on his feet, dodging the attack with ease and taking the opportunity to strike the towering figure with his sword. To Paz's shock and horror, his sword shattered upon impact, leaving him defenseless against his opponent. The towering figure seized the moment and delivered a devastating blow with his mace, sending Paz flying several meters away and crashing into the barricade. The crowd gasped in horror as Paz lay motionless on the ground, his fate uncertain. As Paz slowly regained consciousness, he was acutely aware of the pain radiating throughout his body. He gingerly counted his ribs, wincing as he realized how many had been fractured in the previous battle. But as he looked up, he saw the towering figure raising his mace high in the air, preparing to strike the final blow. With lightning-quick reflexes, Raz leaped off the ground and dodged the attack, using his broken sword to slice toward the giant's eye, blinding him momentarily. Raz then evaded the giant's punch and darted towards him with a smooth and swift strike that brought the giant down in one fell swoop like Levi in Attack on Titan. Paz had been so focused on planning victory words to finish off the fight that he had forgotten to account for the fact that he was gushing blood and barely able to speak. Paz soon left the arena on a stretcher. As the night wore on and the odds turned against Irene's team, Gray found himself in a different part of town, working tirelessly to fashion a weapon to replace the sword. The clanging of metal echoed through the streets as Gray poured all of his creativity and determination into his task. Back in the arena, the tension was palpable as the fight continued well into the night. Irene's team was vastly outnumbered, with only 6 able-bodied fighters left to take on Casper's 61 men. The chief knight barked orders at Paz, blaming his mercenaries for failing to hold their own in most of the fights. Paz simply shrugged and retorted that they were just mercenaries, lighting for money and not their lives. This only served to infuriate the chief knight further, but he knew deep down that he had no real reason to blame them. As yet another of Irene's fighters fell to Casper's forces, the chief knight sprinted back towards the arena, knowing that he was the only person left who could make a real difference in the fight. Suddenly, a deafening roar shook the ground beneath him, causing him to stumble and nearly lose his footing. He turned around to see a lone figure holding onto a giant door that was the size of a 3-story building. The chief knight couldn't believe his eyes as he watched in awe as the figure lifted the door with ease and hurled it toward Casper's troops. Gray inquired of the chief knight with how many Casper's knights were left. The chief knight, having regained his composure, replied with unwavering resolve, "Over 50 knights go, Gray, go beat their ass." A wry smile spread across Gray's countenance, feeling pleased as punch that he arrived at the perfect moment. With a mighty heave, he hurled the massive door towards the arena, causing a seismic tremor to reverberate through the arena. It crashed down in front of a hapless knight wielding an axe. He felt he was holding a rubber toy in comparison to the giant door. Scaling the door with ease, Gray clutched onto the chains and surveyed the battlefield below, locking eyes with one of Casper's knights. The knight, peering up at Gray and the behemoth door, weighed his options for a moment before gracefully laying down his weapon and dropping to his knees in surrender. A palpable sense of dread swept through Casper's army like a contagion, infecting every soldier with a paralyzing fear. Not a single soul dared to step forward to face the impending doom, and the ranks began to dissolve into a maelstrom of chaos as they turned on each other in a frantic attempt to avoid their inevitable fate. Casper, himself, was struck with a sense of sheer horror as his eyes fell upon the colossal door, the very gate of his own palace. The realization that his enemy had brought this door to serve as a brazen taunt caused his blood to run cold. The butler delivered the dire news to Casper, his face a portrait of despair. "None of the knights are willing to fight, we must consider alternate options." Casper rose to his feet, his eyes fixed on Gray, and started complimenting Gray. Nodding in admiration, then questioned if Gray wanted to switch to a horse fight. Irene, standing nearby, bristled at the suggestion and informed Casper that he is violating his own rules. Casper chuckled wryly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Ah, Irene, always so by the book. And if you refuse, my knights will refuse to fight. That's not something we want to see, right?" Turning to Gray, Casper posed the question with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Do you accept the challenge, my friend?" "Oh, silly Casper, you don't know what you are getting into." Gray scratched his head in bemusement. Gray asked if he could fight all of Casper's knights all at once. The very notion of such a preposterous idea caused a ripple of disbelief among the onlookers, but to Casper's delight, he accepted the offer without hesitation. "A wonderful offer indeed," he exclaimed. "Oh man. You silly fat man. Why are you doing this to yourself?" Irene strode purposefully towards Gray, her eyes boring into his with a fierce intensity. "Are you absolutely certain of your decision, Sir Gray?" she demanded, her voice ringing out across the courtyard. Gray straightened his back, his hand tapping the gleaming plate of his armor in a confident gesture. "I give you my word, Lady Irene. I shall emerge victorious in this battle, and bring glory to your name." A wide smile spread across Irene's face, her eyes sparkling with pride, counting everything onto Gray. With Irene's blessing ringing in his ears, Gray leaped off the gate and onto the back of his trusty steed, Tanitos. As he rode out onto the field, the butler barked out orders to the waiting knights, who quickly donned their armor and mounted their own horses. In a matter of moments, they were charging towards Gray in a thunderous display of power and might, but amidst the chaos and thundering of hooves, a tiny figure suddenly stirred. It was none other than Kitty, who had been napping peacefully on Tanito's head. Startled awake by the commotion, Kitty's eyes widened in shock as he took in the sight before him. Over 50 knights, brandishing swords and spears, their eyes fixed on a lone figure charging towards them on horseback. What in the name of catnip is going on here? With a thunderous roar, the bald captain gathered his knights and bellowed out orders like a lion commanding its pride. He commanded them to form a tight formation and charge toward the trio like a tsunami of steel. As the knights charged, Gray stood his ground with a confident smirk on his face. When the bald captain swung his sword, Gray dodged it with the grace of a ballerina, twirling his own sword like a seasoned medieval knight. In a flash, he lunged forward and struck the bald captain with a fierce blow. The captain cried out in agony, but his anguish was short-lived as he soon realized that Gray's sword did no damage to him, but before he could react, he was interrupted by the sound of tiny paws slapping Gray's head. Kitty, the ever-vigilant cat, had witnessed Gray's pathetic attempt at looking cool and was quick to remind him of his foolishness. Kitty scratched Gray with his paw and meowed, and Gray hung his head in shame, but he had a trick up his sleeve. Knowing he can't use a sword right now, he went back to his old route of using Lich power. He tapped into his Lich power and cast 3 quadruple spells on Tanitos, granting him enhanced strength, armor, and swiftness. As the bald captain and his men charged once again, Gray stood his ground, his eyes glowing with dark power. Tanitos, the mighty warhorse, galloped toward the knights like a stampede of wild beasts. His hooves thundered against the ground, kicking left, right, and center, kicking the knights so hard that their mother won't even recognize them. The knights stood in terror, their hands holding the sword shaking, but they were no match for the brute force of Tenido's. One brave knight saw an opportunity and lunged forward with his spear, aiming to knock Gray off his horse. But to his surprise, his spear hit an invisible barrier that he couldn't penetrate. In an instant, Tenido slammed his hooves into the man's face with such force that he was knocked unconscious. The arena erupted in chaos as the other knights cursed and groaned, writhing in agony on the ground. But through it all, Gray, Kitty, and Tenido's remained standing, unscathed and victorious. Casper, the overweight spectator, watched with his jaw hanging open in disbelief. "Gray must be cheating," he exclaimed. "Really? Come on, you degenerate, fat man, you were the person who actually cheated." Anyway, back to the story. As the dust settled, Arion approached Gray and handed him his sword, addressing him as Mr. Knight. Gray's heart swelled with pride as he realized that he had earned the respect of his peers. He wondered if he could now be granted the title of knight, and Arion smiled brightly, promising to grant him his knighthood. The spectators roared with excitement, witnessing the birth of a new legend. History books would later recount the events of this day, marking it as the spring of 10,753 of the Holy Calendar. In the southern part of the Celtics continent in the kingdom of Lisa, a great knight had been born, one who would change the course of history forever. Gray is yet to know what he will be accomplishing in the future, but for now, the crowd threw the duo high up in the air celebrating his victory, but as for Gray himself, Gray felt a mix of emotions welling up inside him, joy, excitement, and a touch of bewilderment. He started crying, unsure why is everyone throwing him high in the air. 날 보고 있음 음악이 baby 너를 위한 melody yeah 네가 뮤지니까 잘 들어봐 play it